May 14th, 1948, 4 p.m. Tel Aviv. On a small podium stands a determined Zionist leader before a hastily convened gathering, reading out a proclamation which would change the course of history. This is how the State of Israel was born.
Inhabited by both Arabs and Jews, Palestine had been under the rule of Great Britain for 3 decades. In 1947, Britain announced that it planned to leave, its soldiers and economy exhausted by World War II. Zionists saw the chance to establish a country of their own, while Arabs denounced the proposed Jewish state as an attempt to steal Arab land. War between Arabs and Jews seemed inevitable.
Life matters, and the issues in life matter because they affect how we live our lives. In this podcast, Pastor Walt McFadden thinks out loud about truth and discerns how it is being applied to everyday life. Thinking Out Loud podcast is a production of City View Church in Minneapolis, Minnesota.
You know, Pastor Walt, I've been a Christian quite a long time, and one of the revelations that came into my life a number of years ago was the importance of Israel. Went through seminary, as we all have, been trained. So often, Israel is not mentioned in the theology, it's not mentioned in any kind of literature. It's almost as if the church forgets its foundation. And so we're going to talk about that. I want you to think out loud about Israel today. So Israel has great history. Why don't we begin there, I guess?
That's the biggest problem, is people don't know the history. And the issue is, does Israel have the right to exist? What is my perspective on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? I'm a history buff. I love history, and I've done a lot of research and reading about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And so just to give a little direction today, going back to the history, how did we get to this point? What is our response as a Christian? So I'm going to just deal with that question today first, and we'll talk in the future a little more about Israel and what is Israel's future in relation to the church, because I believe that God still has a plan for the Jewish people. I believe that they are God's chosen people, and that the church has not replaced Israel, but has come along Israel in God's covenant plan. So just historically, the nation of Israel was occupied by the Canaanites and other tribes and people groups until about 1500 BC. No one exactly sure when the exodus from Egypt occurred, but the Israelites came and they conquered. And then in about 586 BC, the nation was destroyed by the Babylonian Empire, and most of the educated people and the wealthy people and royalty were carried away in exile. Some remained there. Interestingly enough, a large group went down to Egypt, and you see that in the book of Jeremiah. But King Cyrus of Persia, when he conquered the Babylonian Empire, sent people back to rebuild the nation. And so the nation never went away. It just, most of the people went into exile. And it remained a nation again. And one of the key events, of course, was the destruction of the temple in 70 A.D. And that's where some people believe wrongly that God rejected the Jewish people because of the crucifixion of Jesus. The Jewish people were the hardest people to rule. They were adamant that they were under a curse if they were under Roman rule or foreign domination. And they just kept rebelling. In 130 A.D., the Emperor Hadrian ordered that all of the Jews be expelled. The nation was plowed under with salt, so nothing could grow there. The Romans did the same thing when they conquered the Empire of Carthage. And so they just wanted the land desolate. They didn't want anybody living there. They wanted all the Jews to be removed. And then, to add insult to injury, he renamed the land Palestine.
And that's where we have the problem, right? Because since that time, of course, we think of that area as Palestine, but it wasn't initially called that.
Correct. You know what Palestine is? It's our word, or our translation for the Hebrew word Philistine.
Right.
And so he thought, I'm going to insult the Jews further, and I'm going to name this after their ancient enemies. There were no Palestinian people. There are no people groups that exist today. Nobody knows where the Philistines came. They were probably Greek people who came down and settled on the coast there, and they lived in places that we still recognize today, like Gaza. So we think about the Gaza Strip. But in terms of a people group today, I won't accept the idea that there is a Palestinian people. There are Arab people who lived in an area that was named Palestine.
Commentator Ben Shapiro confirms, Pastor Walt, what you're saying when he talks about Jordan and Israel.
That the Palestinians have a right to an independent state. There is no such historic right for the Palestinians to have an independent state. That state was called Jordan historically. Right? When they partitioned British Mandate Palestine, there were two states, right? Originally, there were really only two states, and it was Jordan and Israel, and that was it. So there's no history to having a second Palestinian state in the region. Jordan is 70% Palestinian.
Well, I think that makes sense, that there wasn't ever a Palestinian state, and yet today we have heard so much support that there was. Well, let's move on to the church and the tensions between the Jews and Christians, because there is a history of tension that is not healthy.
Christians became more hostile toward Jewish people, which never should have happened. Then you go all the way up into the Reformation, and you see some of the things that Martin Luther wrote. As I understand it, he wrote those things in his later years. Some people think he actually was beginning to suffer some type of dementia, and he became very angry and very hostile against the Jewish people, and the Nazis used some of that as propaganda, and the church bought into it, and then of course we wound up with the Holocaust.
This treaty by Dr. Martin Luther of the Jewish problem has been virtually hidden from all American people and promises to shake, shock, and alert Christian America, the Jews and their lies. I had decided not to write anymore, neither of the Jews nor against the Jews, because I have learned, however, that those miserable, wicked people do not cease trying to win over to themselves us. That is, the Christian also. I have permitted this booklet to go forth that I might be found among those who have resisted such poisonous undertaking of the Jews, and have warned the Christians to be on their guard against them.
I want to start in World War I. The Middle East is controlled by the Muslim Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire, which it was centralized in Turkey, and it had been growing weaker and weaker, and during World War I, they decided to side with the Germans, which made sense because the Ottomans and the Russians, still to this day, they're enemies, the Turks and the Russians. So it made sense that they would join Germany, and they lost the war. And the British and the French, who gained most of the power, Russia had really stepped out of World War I because of the Russian Revolution. France and Britain stepped in, and they divided up the land that was the Ottoman Empire. Most of the land in the north, which would be Syria and some parts of Iraq, went to French rule, and that southern area, which would be modern-day Israel and Jordan, was given to the British. The British had talked for quite some time, and the idea of Zionism, which is a loaded term, started in the late 1800s. There were books being written, propaganda, the idea of a homeland for the Jewish people. So that was something that was talked about for decades, and they were actually battles, skirmishes, uprisings all through the 20s and 30s from the Arab people against the Jewish people, and there were Jewish people living in the area that was termed the British Mandate. If I could show a map on the podcast, which I can't, you would just look at a really large area that encompassed more than Jordan and Israel and extended over into what would be modern-day Iraq. And so there was discussion, how are we going to divide this land up and who's going to get what?
Now, was that known as the Balfour Declaration in 1917? Well, what was that all about? Because I think there was some sort of agreement with France and France and England to give this land, right?
Yeah, it started even at the beginning of World War I. They started to discuss and say, we want to have a homeland for the Jewish people, and if we win this war, what are we going to do with all of this land? British and the French had somewhat of an imperialistic mindset, and of course, the Ottoman Empire had been the enemies of Europe for hundreds of years, and they finally ended the Eastern Roman Empire. Most people don't know that the Western Roman Empire ended about 500 AD. The Eastern Empire continued on for another 1,000 years after that, and Constantinople, Constantine, his city was taken over. That
Which
city
is Istanbul today.
Istanbul, yeah. And it was about 25% of that region was Christian. We think of it as 100% 100% Muslim. It was Muslim-dominated area, but about 25% of the people there were Christian. And most of those people were either killed or driven out of that territory. You know, we have places like Ephesus that had been Christian for almost 2,000 years. And all of a sudden, it's just decimated. And all of this began to happen around the time of World War I, when there was a great shift in borders. So let me just kind of move ahead here. Nothing gets done through the 20s and 30s. There's this constant rejection by the Arabic people. We're not going to accept a homeland for the Jews. We want all of the land. But these are people who are under the Ottoman Empire. There is no nation of Turkey. There is no nation of Syria. There is no nation of Palestine. There's just one big empire, just a big mass of land. And now you have to solve the problem. When this empire collapses, what are we going to do with this land? And how are we going to equitably divide it up? So then they start the process. They come up to World War II. The British have control, the French have control. It looks for a brief amount of time that the Germans are going to take over. So there's battles in Palestine through World War II. And they come up with the idea that they're going to take a vast majority of the land, which is called the Transjordan. So on the eastern side of the Jordan River, they're going to give that land to Arab people, and that's going to form a new nation, the nation of Jordan. If the Arabs had their way, all of Palestine would have been absorbed into that nation, and we would just have the nation of Jordan, and it would extend all the way over to the Mediterranean Sea. But they wanted a homeland for the Jews. So they took this tiny little strip of land, and we've seen these memes on Facebook, and it says, you know, here's the Arab land, and here's the Jewish land. And it's this tiny little piece of land. And that wasn't good enough. So they took another big chunk of that, about a third to a half of the land that was designated for the Jewish people. One of those areas was Gaza. And that was the ancient area where those Philistine people lived, who have disappeared from history. They don't exist. So really, the term or the idea Palestine, in my mind, I'm just never going to accept that. I'm just going to accept the fact that they were Arab people in Palestine at the end of World War II. So Jordan gets all of its land, and Lebanon is reformed, Syria is formed, Iraq is formed, and nobody has a problem with any of that. But this big deal starts with the Jewish people. And at around the time of the beginning, about 500,000 Jewish people had emigrated from Europe, trying to escape the persecution, and had landed in there. The British are constantly trying to keep them out. They're trying to limit immigration to please the Arab people. But once you have it in your mind that this is our land, the Jewish people don't belong here, there's a stubbornness. There's no working with them. So one more thing that I was going to say is World War II changed everything. It literally changed the world. All kinds of borders of countries were redrawn. A lot of people don't know, but about 5 million German people, ethnic Germans, were kicked out of their countries and sent back to Germany. Nobody has a problem with that. So in Czechoslovakia, they think about 1 million German people who had lived in that region for hundreds of years. They were kicked out and they were sent back to Germany.
Was there a specific reason for that?
Good question. Part of it was retribution. So they were paying back the German people. You have to go and you have to consolidate. The other reason was that they recognized that there was just too much hostility. I mean, German people were being massacred especially in Poland. There were millions of German people, ethnic Germans, who were killed in Poland. Of course, they were put behind the Iron Curtain, and they were trying to escape and get different places, but the main reason was for retribution. Another interesting thing that happened during that period of the 20s and 30s, the Ottoman Empire was reforming, and there was a revolution in what we know as Turkey now. And so the nation of Turkey was born, and Turkey wanted Christians out, and they especially wanted their ancient enemies, the Greeks, out. So they expelled maybe 500,000 or more Greek-speaking people, ethnic Greeks, out of the country. And the Greeks, in retaliation, expelled about 1 million Turks. So again, there's a retribution, a retaliation. Think of how much land was owned by those Turkish people or Greek-speaking people, or ethnic Greeks, I have to use the right term. They never want their land back. They never claim that they have rights in Turkey, and vice versa with the two countries. And this happened all over the world. Large portions of Germany was given up forever. France recovered this large region called Alsace and Lorraine at the end of the war. It had passed back and forth for centuries, and France still has that land. Nobody says there's more Germans living there. We want that land back. They tried their best at the end of a war that had killed 40 or 50 million people to draw up new borders and make peace in the world. My question to those who believe that Israel has no right to exist, has no right to land, that their land was stolen, why isn't there effort to have people all over the world reclaim land that once belonged to them?
That's a good question. Yeah, very insightful.
You're listening to Thinking Out Loud with Pastor Walt McFadden.
So at the end of World War II, the Russians got a lot of land. They took over a lot of countries that they had conquered during World War II, and they became communists. So what actually happened to Palestine, or what they are calling Palestine? What nations of the world wanted Israel to have its own country? Was it universally accepted?
For the most part, I think the United States, I believe, if my research is right, they cast the first vote.
They did.
To be positive.
Mm-hmm.
Great Britain, France, those nations. So we also had the newly formed United Nations, and then their solution as a compromise was to take a large chunk of that area that they called Palestine, form the nation of Israel, and then reserve, again, about a third or a half of that land as a homeland for these people that are deemed Palestinians. But if you really think about it, these are people without a country as well. These are people who are hard to track. We don't see biblically, and this is one of the most amazing things about it. I want to be objective in my research, but there's also a spiritual element. So we ask the question, why is this one spot in the world battled over? Why is it in dispute? We know there's a spiritual element. We know that Satan wants to destroy the Jewish people because they are God's chosen people.
Well, and I had one commentator say to me that Jesus had to come the first time to a land, and he's coming a second time to a land, and it has to be a land of Israel. I mean, that's where he's coming back to, right? So if you destroy the land, there's no place to come back to. Now, that's kind of simplistic, but in a way, makes a little sense.
Absolutely, and if you recall in my sermon on Sunday, you were there, I talked about the great hope of the Christian faith, that Jesus came the first time to the city of Jerusalem, and he was crucified, died, and rose again there, and Jesus is going to come again. This time, he's going to bring a new Jerusalem that he's been working on and preparing for us, and he's going to put it right there on that same spot. Isn't it interesting that that tiny little country is the epicenter of the world? Everything that happens in that country affects the rest of the world. I want to just conclude with encouragement. There's a book that every Christian needs to read if you are in dispute about God's plan for the Jewish people. As America has done to Israel. John P. McTernan, As America Has Done to Israel. Read it. And it'll show with facts that every time the United States backs the loss of land for the Jewish people, they suffer some type of natural disaster. You just read it and just make your own conclusion about it. Israel is a democracy. It's a friend to the United States. Iraq, Iran, Syria, Saudi Arabia, they've all tried to destroy Israel. They're still trying to destroy Israel, some of them anyway. Why would the United States be against a democracy that has been an ally of the United States for decades? I think I've laid out a pretty good conclusion outside of the biblical evidence, but I'll tell you there is a spiritual element involved, and the church better be very careful about how it handles and deals with the Jewish people. Because God said, I will bless those who bless you and curse those who curse you.
And that's right out of Genesis chapter 12, verse 3, which is one of those key verses, I think, in all of Scripture that really supports what you're saying. But Pastor Walt, as you have given us a great history lesson, why is it that many pastors won't go down that path and see the importance of Israel in history as well as in its present as well as future role that it will play in the coming of our Lord? Why are we so afraid of it?
The biggest reason, and you might be surprised at this, Larry, is not because of the political implications, but because they don't understand the Bible. They don't understand God's plan. They don't understand when God makes a covenant with people, God keeps the covenant. And there is a certain feeling of that this is embarrassing for the church to talk about the end times. When's the last time we've talked about the return of Jesus Christ? When's the last time we heard a sermon about Jesus coming back to the city of Jerusalem?
Well, I'm sure we hear it in your church, but you're right. Generally speaking, 90% of churches will not talk about it.
Because we'd rather talk about your best life now.
Yes, that's absolutely true. I know in the future we're going to deal with the spiritual ramifications of Israel and the church and the importance Israel plays. But as we leave this podcast, what would you recommend for people to read or to talk through or to talk with yourself or others about this issue of Israel? What advice would you give?
First off, know your history. You don't know where you're going unless you know where you came from. So you got to know your history. You got to read the Old Testament. Some guys just won't preach out of the Old Testament. There's plenty of commentaries out there. And then find somebody, don't read somebody who believes in replacement theology. We'll talk about that next time. That is, the church has replaced Israel. Don't follow somebody who's got that teaching. It's not biblical. Nowhere in the Scripture does it say that God has rejected the Jewish people.
In fact, it's just the opposite. Well, thanks, Pastor Walt, and we'll look forward to the next installment of your talk on Israel and the spiritual ramifications. That's next time on Thinking Out Loud with Pastor Walt McFadden.
We hope you enjoyed the podcast today, and please let us know your thoughts on our topic. We want to hear your feedback and your concerns as you think out loud. Please visit us at cvcmpls.org. That's cvcmpls.org. This podcast is listener supported. Please consider how you can help by going to our website at cvcmpls.org.